Hello and welcome to Topshelf Bookcasts. If you're joining us for the very first time, I will hopefully be adding to your TBR with some popular Touchstone books as well as some new favorites. Welcome to episode 5. We're doing something a little bit different that I am excited to try and will likely be doing again. One of the things I like to do when I am sort of stressed out and can't think about anything sensible or sane is to imagine the bookshelves of my favorite characters. And of course, it requires a suspension of disbelief because, certain books would not coincide with the dates or, if it's fantasy characters, the world. But it's still something that I enjoy doing. So in this episode, we are going to explore what I imagine we would find on the bookshelf of Maxwell Q. Klinger from MASH. So join me in this adventure. Obviously, these are just my views of what I think the character might enjoy, headcanons, if you will, so nothing too serious, but hopefully something fun. Maxwell Q. Klinger is played by actor Jamie Farr, and I have said in a Tumblr post somewhere along the way that I can chart my life by the fictional men that I've fallen in love with. I didn't see Klinger coming, but I probably should have, because the first fictional man I can remember falling in love with is Jareth from The Labyrinth, the Goblin King. You don't get much more androgynous than the Goblin King, so maybe there's a type there. I did not expect Jamie Farr and MASH, however. During the pandemic, the love of my life said, let's watch MASH because it gives me this feeling of nostalgia. My family had it on in the evenings. And I'll be honest with you, I was initially resistant because all I could remember of MASH was my dad trying to watch it when I was young and the very fake looking but very bright and to a young child frightening images of blood. I thought it was a serious show. You're small, you don't know any better. I didn't realize it was a comedy, but we did end up watching MASH, and it did end up becoming a life saving thing for me because upon watching the show, I reached out into the fandom, and this was during a lot of isolation with the early stages of the pandemic, and I really needed new friends. And I have made friends that have changed my life and stayed with me, and that is a really wonderful thing. I have also gotten to hear from Mr. Farr in the form of a cameo. So if anyone's thinking, they really need to get a gift for me, I would love to hear from him again. Before we dive into the imaginary bookshelf of Max Klinger, who should be the star of MASH as far as I'm concerned, I thought that I should pause on the intersection of books and Jamie Farr properly. Of course, there is his autobiography, Just for Fun, and he is also the writer of the introduction for Toledo Treasures and Traditions, and we'll talk more about Toledo in the moments ahead. If you need something adorable for the holiday season, he and his wife Joy co-authored Hababy's Christmas Eve as well. This is not the invisible camel, but apparently it's quite visible offspring that appears. Very, very cute. So something to consider for the upcoming holidays. Of course, one of the things that the character Maxwell Klinger is famous for is trying to escape from the army, and we cannot blame him, right? Ridiculous draft. So I believe he would probably enjoy a title like Prisoners of the Castle about a famous escape during World War II, because his own escapes are so very daring. And as I was thinking about Max and reading, I imagined an elaborate MASH plot in which he got one of his relatives to pretend to be a librarian and insist that he come home to pay ridiculous library fines, which is very ridiculous, but not more so than inflating a raft on your commanding officer's desk or becoming a big red bird with fuzzy pink feet. So I think it fits right in there if the MASH writers want to get in touch with me. We do know from the show that Max is canonically a reader, so I wanted to pay tribute to that before picking out the books that I think he would read. We actually do see him interacting in the show. Famously, when he's hurt in Operation Friendship, he tries to get Charles to read to him from I, the Jury by Mickey Spillane. So I am imagining the Shrinking Island, a Mickey Spillane collection for Maxwell's bookshelf because, more bang for your buck. We also see him take a vocabulary course at some point, so I imagine that in his tent there's probably Funk and Wagnall's Standard College Dictionary. Besides scheming to get out of the army, Klinger also schemes to climb the social ladder and to get rich. So I think I can imagine someone that tries to create a newspaper to sell in camp and get behind the hula hoop might, like Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich. Although I trust that after the show, he would be quite successful and not necessarily need the schemes because he's adorable. One of the things that the show really centers on, and I think personally does a poor job with, is race and culture when it comes to Klinger's character. So we learn very early on that he's Lebanese. We learn that members of his family don't speak English, for example. And I never understood why a show where Alan Alda in particular campaigned so hard to do away with some of the things that we saw happening to women. So the assaults that happened to Margaret, for example, and some of the language. He really talked to the writers about, this is not something that should be happening. But the racist things never go away from the show. And it's something that I really regret about Klinger's character. And I'm sure that although I believe that Farr is a consummate professional, I imagine it would be hurtful to have to say some of those lines, especially when it's played for comedy over and over. So thinking about Klinger's heritage, I did want to include a cookbook. I did my research to find sort of the most recommended Lebanese cookbook, which is A Taste of Lebanon. So going to learn to make something from there. Although I do not think Klinger will be cooking in camp, of course, but it would be fun to look at the recipes and think about his relatives back home, I'm sure. I also included Nizar Kabani's Arabian love poems because we do learn that Klinger's mom writes to him in Arabic. I'm sure he misses hearing his first language. I did promise that we would talk about Toledo, and Klinger is, of course, famously from Toledo and famously loves his hometown. There's a wonderful moment in the show where he's talking it up to Margaret and she says, Klinger, I've been there. So it's wonderful to him because it is home. And even Sherman Potter, whose character I think is sometimes ridiculously hard on Klinger, as so many of the characters are, especially when it comes to his background. One of my least favorite episodes of the show is one in which the characters are making fun of memorabilia that he's brought from home, decorations and things, and just really beating up on him for his taste. And these are, of course, things that remind him of his family. So not my favorite moment from the show, but I do like that Potter embraces Klinger's love of Toledo enough to sometimes wear the gear, which Harry Morgan really did in real life as well. So coming to talk about Toledo and heritage, I would also include The Lebanese in the World by Albert Harani and Nadim Shahadi. Not because I necessarily think that Klinger would be reading it, but because I think that you should. The waves of immigration that came to the United States are fascinating in sort of how they are timed and how the country negotiates, often in horrible ways, with letting people in or keeping people out. So definitely worth your time to to take a look at that, not just Lebanese immigration, but all of it in general. For Klinger, I would include The Streets of Toledo, A Pictorial History, because I'm sure he would want to think about his exploits back home and look at the pictures. And then also Joseph Giha's Through and Through Toledo Stories, because not only are they set in his hometown, but they do include Lebanese characters. So Klinger would get a chance to see himself reflected on the page. And I'm sure that you know, as a reader yourself, that's one of the most wonderful things you can have happen when you're reading, is to see a reflection and think, someone out there gets me, someone sees me. It's very refreshing, and for some of us, it's entirely too rare. Besides his love of his hometown, Klinger is also, of course, famous for trying to escape the army by wearing dresses, attempting to get his Section 8, the honorable way. And of course, in his attempts to escape, he crosses paths with psychiatrist Sidney Freeman, whom he eventually wins over to a friendship, even though Sidney does not sign him out. I think those swamp rat surgeons could have gotten together and let him loose. 3 signatures, that's all you need. That's all I'm saying. Not that I would want him to leave the screen. But when it comes to understanding the Section 8 and sort of understanding the military's views on how one's mind works, especially during the Korean War, there's a famous manual called Psychology for the Fighting Man. Now, Klinger is perfectly capable of coming up with wonderful schemes on his own, but I don't think he would be above paging through to try to find out new angles to try. I don't know if I will lose any respect that you potentially could have for me if I tell you that I am recording in my own Mud Hens jersey, even as we speak. It's just what I felt I had to do for Jamie Baby. He would appreciate it. So we know that Klinger is a baseball fan, and he famously annoys Charles endlessly in the episode in which the Giants win the pennant. So I wanted to include Roger Kahn's Boys of Summer because it's an amazing sports narrative, and I think Klinger would like getting lost in it in the winter months when he could not be playing baseball. I have taught a sports literature class for several years, and I always joke with my students that they are responsible for sports and I am responsible for literature, because I actually, every time that I talk about a sport, have to sit there and think in a sort of paranoid back of the mind way, is this a field or a court? What is the scoring mechanism? I talk in generalities when it comes to sports, so Klinger would despair of me. If you are at all involved in MASH fandom through Reddit or Tumblr or whatever mechanism you get into the social media world, you have probably seen the joke that because MASH is owned by Fox and Fox was bought by Disney, Klinger is in fact a Disney princess. Of course he's a princess. He's beautiful. And he looks great in a tiara. So in honor of him being a princess, Disney or not, if they want to like get on making a Funko Pop of that, I would be all for it. I wanted to include How to Read a Dress by Lydia Edwards because Klinger is, of course, very fashion forward in his creations, initially as an attempt to get out of the army, but we do see him taking enjoyment in his creations and actually coming to like making them and enjoying helping other people in the camp to create things. So altering dresses for Margaret, for example, or lending her his wedding dress. He genuinely comes to enjoy these things. And I like to believe that after the war, he would be involved in some form of design. Maybe for Hollywood, he would fit in great there. So How to Read a Dress would definitely fit on his bookshelf. When asking Klinger to borrow a dress for his date, Charles famously calls Klinger a gentleman and a lady. MASH was, of course, made in the 70s. It was not always forward thinking about a great many things. I've already mentioned the assaults that occur, or at least attempts at assault that occur towards Margaret. But one of the things that's very refreshing about Klinger as a character is we never see him attacked or harmed over his choice of clothing and his representation. Initially, the character was supposed to be acted as a gay character, and Farr kind of negotiated, um, got to refilm the initial scene and plays Klinger as a straight character who is just very matter of fact about the clothing that he wore. You can find interviews where Farr talks about the fact that he did get letters from audience members who were trans or gay or queer or whatever label they would want to take on, and they were grateful to him for being a character that was positive in his presentation, even if it's not overtly queer. Of course, some people do read it that way now. So for Klinger's bookshelf, I would include June Singer's Androgyny. Androgyny has fallen out of favor as a term, and this is an old book, but there isn't really a current one. So I wanted to include it just because I think Klinger does really embody male and female traits in a way that's really unique and interesting. To that, we can add unzipping gender, sex, cross dressing, and culture. You have to love that on the cover of the book there is a cigar. Could almost be Klinger on there. And As You Like It, William Shakespeare's play, I think that Klinger would get an absolute kick out of the fact that originally all Shakespearean parts were played by men. And when it comes to As You Like It, you have male actors playing female characters who then dress up as men and present themselves as men. So lots and lots of layers that he would have understood. And of course, besides talking about Klinger's presentation when it comes to gender, we have to talk about the clothes. His costumes are beautiful, and you can find interviews where Farr talks about how fun it was to have these racks of clothing when everyone else had the olive drab. The show really is green and brown, so we are thankful for Klinger to bring us a spot of color onto the screen. Of course, as the seasons continued, Farr eventually negotiated to get out of the dresses. What I read is that he was worried about his children being bullied. They were getting to an age where their classmates were aware of the show, and of course, kids can be mean. So, if that is in fact what happened, I do respect him looking out for his kids. But I do regret it in terms of the show universe itself. I do miss Klinger's costumes as the show continues. On his bookshelf for clothes, I can imagine there being books like The Golden Thread by St. Clair, How Fabric Changed History, Threads of Life by Hunter, again, the world through sort of the clothes we wear, the culture surrounding it, Fabric by Finley, Patchwork by Wilcox, and I've included also Worn on This Day because the cover has Mrs. Kennedy in her famous, sad and famous, right, pink suit. And I think that several times the show motions towards that outfit with some of Klinger's clothing. He looks great in pink. I also want to include The Life and Death of a Garment, Unraveled by Maxine Bidat. It's a more modern piece, and it takes a smaller view than some of the larger works like The Golden Thread, but it's absolutely worth your time, especially since right now we're having a lot of conversations about fast fashion and mending and reusing. Because of his social status and class status, I think that Klinger would know a lot about repurposing garments and would constantly be debuting new looks that came from the old ones. I also tried to think about some books that would have some connection to the people in camp that Klinger would spend time with. The most similar book to MASH that I can think of, strangely enough, is the Victorian novel Middlemarch by George Eliot. It has nothing to do with what's going on in MASH properly. There's no war. But Middlemarch includes a community that is so tangled in one another, and they all know what's going on with everyone else, and they form these deep bonds, and there are found families, and in some cases the original family, but you have to find them again. And I think the MASH crew would understand that. And of course, MASH fans like to speculate, would the characters see each other after the show? Could they bear to do that? That sort of thing. So Middlemarch, if you have not experienced it, absolutely worth your time. I have a list of books that I call my desert island books. There are too many to take to a desert island. I would need one of those ridiculous luggage trunks that you can float away on, like in Joe versus the Volcano, to get them there. But Middlemarch is one of them. I also imagine, given what we know from the show, that reading material is very sparse. So we see the excitement in camp when there's a mystery novel. There's the episode where Charles tries to keep his newspapers away from the other characters to his ultimate embarrassment. So I could see Klinger rifling through Potter's materials and finding something like Markham's masterpiece about horse care. Of course, it's an incredibly old text, but horses haven't changed much, and I absolutely believe that Potter would keep the classics around. If we're going to talk about Klinger, we have to talk about hats. The cherry hat is my absolute favorite. If anyone knows how to create the cherry hat and wants to put it on Etsy, I promise you my money. Don't know where the money is coming from, given my current state of life. I will have to become Klinger-esque in my schemes to acquire this fashion, but I love that cherry hat. So on Max's shelf, I can imagine Hats, A History of Fashion and Headwear by Hilda Amphlett. I believe that he would love to sort of see fashion played out in headgear and be amused and debut new looks because of it. And I've also included a book on fascinators because it is through Klinger that I really learned about fascinators. I find him to be absolutely fascinating, so why not his headgear as well? So I've already talked about the canonical aspects of Klinger as a character. So the next few books are really springing out of my own preferences, my own headcanons for the character. So if they do not fit your particular view, feel free to ignore me. But my two favorite characters on the show are Klinger and also Charles, and I really wish that the show had allowed them to develop more of a friendship. I understand it's an ensemble show, and eventually it really becomes Alan Alda's show. He was writing, directing, and being the central actor. I understand that. But I tried to think about books that I could imagine appealing to Klinger if he did manage to develop a friendship or a relationship with Winchester. And The Folded Leaf by William Maxwell is another one of my desert island books. It's so beautiful, but it has these two male characters that aren't sure what to make of one another, and there's a lot of intensity of feelings there, but they're very different from one another. So I really do think in the show those two just strike such nice sparks off of one another. Just amazing actors. I'll have to give Charles his own bookshelf later. Autobiography of Red by Anne Carson. Beautiful book of poetry. One of the characters in a relationship in Autobiography of Red, the main character, has wings, and he is distinguished by this and sort of completely out of place in any landscape that he's in. And this reminds me of Klinger in the sense of he is the character in the show in a dress. He is out of place. He didn't want to be there. So something to think about. And then finally, Joy Street by Frances Parkinson Keyes. I had to work really hard to get this book. It's very much out of print, but it's about Beacon Hill. It's set in Charles's neighborhood, and it deals with a relationship that is complicated by class. And even in the early pages, you have some of these wealthier Bostonians ranting about immigration. So I couldn't help but think of Winchester. Besides wanting to see the show do a deeper dive on Klinger's relationship with Charles and just really expand their friendship, I like to think of, well, I'm drawn to Klinger as a character, and maybe one of the reasons that I do feel he kind of saved me as a character is we all need things to look to that have hope in them, and that we can really feel sincere about the hope. And one of the things I love about Klinger in the show is he is relentlessly kind. he hates his situation, doesn't want to be in the war. He's not trained as a medical man like the swamp rats are or Potter. So he's not used to blood. He's not used to seeing people at their absolute worst, but he's still kind. And he goes out of his way to be kind to the other members of the camp, even though they yell at him and say terrible things to him. He never stops being kind. So he really is a Disney princess in that sense, and I love that about him. So a book that gives me that same feeling of hope and that same sense that there is kindness and goodness out there in the world, thank you, Mr. Farr, is Winter's Tale by Mark Halperin. And then I also like to imagine that Klinger would like Andrew Lang's fairy books, and I've included here a picture of the yellow one because Klinger looks smashing in yellow, and it has the princess on it, so it just felt very fitting for him. So I have no actual canonical basis for these choices, but I feel in my heart that they're right. I would be remiss in ending our discussion if I didn't mention MASH, the show, properly. Perhaps because I love MASH so much, I'm very critical about the books that are published about it. They don't make me happy. I want to write my own, maybe someday. But the fan favorite, the Touchstone book, is The Complete Book of MASH by Susie Coulter. Thank you to my friend Anne for sending me a copy. And I also wanted to mention Watching MASH, Watching America, if you want a more critical pop culture view. And then Thomas Dvorak published a photo book called MASH Iraq, in which he looked at how scenes from his own experience very closely mirrored what was happening in a show that was commenting on Vietnam by using Korea as a sort of shield. And of course, that's sobering and sad that American warfare hasn't changed, that these things are still happening in the world. But for fans of the show, it's a worthwhile book to check out and also a painful one. Those are all of our books for today. Thank you for spending your time with me and letting me share your time and space. I would love to hear from you if you think there are other books that belong on Max's bookshelf, or if there are other characters you would like me to imagine a bookshelf for. You can reach out to me at navalionlibrary@gmail.com, or you can find me at Books in Piles on Tumblr. I would love to hear from you. Again, because we're talking about a character here and everyone has headcanons, I'm not out to convince anyone of anything. I'm not out to change anyone's mind about the character. These are just my views, and I just love and respect this particular character and just enjoy talking about him. So I hope you have found something from his bookshelf to maybe add to your own. And here are today's titles, so do remember to support your local and indie booksellers. If you ever have a question about a price range for a book, please reach out to me. One of my favorite things is chasing books around the universe, and I'm always happy to try to find them in affordable form for you. The rest of today's titles, again, if you have anything that you want to see added to the list, please do let me know. And last but absolutely not least, this is one of my favorite MASH pictures. I would do anything to actually have the photographs from this press conference in which Jamie Farr complains that reporters got between him and his fellow actors and he hasn't gotten to hug them goodbye. So MASH has done so much for me because I have been writing about it for the last few years as in fanfic form and also in research form. And I have made wonderful, wonderful, life-changing friends thanks to this series. So thank you, Mr. Farr, for captivating me and taking me into a space where I wanted to talk about the show and met these wonderful people. It's impossible to tell you all how wonderful you are and what you mean to me. Hopefully I tell you in small ways. I talk to my MASH books almost every day, but thank you for everything that you are and everything that you do.